The final sound the old farmhouse made was the click of the latch. It was a small, dry sound, no louder than a cricket, but it travelled through the oak of the door and into the bones of Martha's hand, which was still raised to knock again. On the other side of that door was her brother-in-law, Franklin, a man whose grief for his dead brother had curdled into a hard, legal avarice. His new wife, a woman with a face as smooth and closed as a river stone, had shut the door without a word, leaving Martha and her mother, Agnes, on the porch that Martha's husband had built. The air on that high plains morning was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Martha lowered her hand and looked at her mother, whose shawled shoulders seemed to have shrunk in the last hour, collapsing inward under the weight of this finality. They had 2 small trunks, a canvas sack of kitchen tools, and the clothes they wore. Franklin, citing a debt he had invented and a will he had interpreted, had taken the rest. The land, the house, the livestock, the future. He had, in a gesture he must have mistaken for charity, left them the one parcel nobody wanted, a forgotten acre at the far edge of the property, a patch of sour ground distinguished only by 2 rusted grain silos, monuments to a failed experiment from a decade before. They were useless, ugly things, and now they were home. The weight of it all settled not in tears, but in a profound and hollow silence. The walk to the silos was less than a mile, but it felt like a journey across a foreign country. The path, once familiar, was now the property of another. The very dust that rose to coat the hem of her dress seemed accusatory. Agnes walked slowly, her breathing a soft, rhythmic rasp in the quiet morning. She did not complain. She had not spoken a word since Franklin had read the paper to them in the parlor, her silence a wall against which his justifications had shattered and fallen flat. Martha carried the heavier trunk, the leather handle digging into her palm, the weight a strange comfort, a physical burden to distract from the other kind. The silos grew larger as they approached, 2 corrugated iron shells catching the morning sun with a dull, defeated glare. They stood 20 feet high, their conical roof streaked with rust that looked like dried blood. Weeds grew thick and tenacious around their bases. A home for snakes and field mice. When they finally stopped between the 2 structures, the wind whistled a low, mournful note as it passed through the gaps in the metal seams. Martha set the trunk down, the thud muffled by the dry soil. She looked at the peeling paint, the dented walls, the gaping hole where a loading chute had been torn away. This was not an ending. It was a place after the end. She felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was the cold of absolute solitude. She was responsible for the frail woman beside her, and this ruin was all she had to offer. Agnes eventually sat on one of the trunks, her hands folded over the worn knob of her walking cane, her gaze fixed on the distant line of the mountains. Martha, however, could not be still. Restlessness was a tool against despair. She began to walk the perimeter of the 2 silos, her boots crunching on gravel and dry stalks. She ran her hands over the cold metal, feeling the pocks and ridges, assessing the decay. The first silo was worse than the second, its western wall buckled inward as if kicked by a giant. But the second one, the one nearer the shallow creek bed, seemed more stable. Its foundation, a ring of poured concrete, was mostly intact. She circled it slowly, her eyes tracing the lines of rust, her mind already working, not on what was lost but on what was here. It was a habit born of a hard life, to see everything as a resource or a problem. Nothing was ever just a thing. As she completed her circuit, her boot scuffed against a patch of ground near the base that was strangely bare, the soil dark and damp where everywhere else it was pale and cracked. She knelt, curiosity a flicker of warmth in the cold emptiness of the day. She pressed her palm flat against the earth. And she felt it. A steady, persistent warmth, rising from some deep and hidden place. It was not the heat of the sun. It was a deep, living heat, a pulse in the stone and soil. She dug her fingers into the dirt, feeling the temperature increase. It was like the gentle heat from a long-banked fire. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling, her hand pressed to the ground, the world falling away until there was only the cold wind on her back and this impossible, secret warmth beneath her hand. The work became her language, her prayer, her argument against the world. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, she was inside the silo, and each evening, she left only when the light failed. The first task was to make it clean. She spent a week sweeping out the accumulated debris of a decade, dried husks, the brittle skeletons of birds, layers of fine, settled dust that rose in choking clouds. She used a borrowed shovel to level the earthen floor, her shoulders and back burning with the effort. When it was clean, the silo was a vast, echoing space, a cathedral of rust and solitude. The worn spot on the floor became the center of this new world. She focused all her energy there, convinced it was the heart of her salvation. Using scrap lumber Franklin had deemed worthless and left to rot behind a barn, she began to construct a platform, a raised floor a foot above the ground to capture the rising heat. Every nail was straightened with careful taps of a hammer, every board measured and cut with a dull saw that she sharpened on a river stone. It was slow, imperfect work. Her hands, accustomed to sewing and baking, became calloused and raw. She learned the language of leverage, the personality of old wood. Once the floor was laid, a small square of 8 feet by 8 feet, she started on the walls. She needed insulation, something to hold the precious warmth within the small chamber she was building. She found her answer in the creek bed, clay. And in the fields beyond, straw. Day after day, she hauled buckets of thick, grey clay and armfuls of dry straw, mixing them with water into a thick, heavy daub. She packed this mixture into a framework of woven willow branches, creating thick, solid walls that sealed her small room away from the cold metal of the silo's shell. Agnes would watch her, sitting on a stool just outside the silo's wide door, her hands busy mending their worn clothes. She rarely spoke, but her presence was a constant, quiet endorsement. "It needs to breathe," Agnes said one afternoon, her voice thin but clear. "Every warm body needs to breathe." Martha stopped, her hands covered in mud, and understood. She left a small, high opening in the wall, a space she would later learn how to vent properly. It was not a house. It was a den, a burrow, a secret chamber built of mud and desperation and a stubborn refusal to freeze. Her trips to town became a quiet trial. She needed things she could not scavenge, a small stovepipe, hinges, a better hammer. She sold the last of her mother's silver hair combs to Mr. Gable, the man who ran the mercantile. He was a man whose small authority was puffed up by the town's collective opinion, and the town's opinion of Martha was clear. She was the widow who had been cast out, the poor woman living in a scrap heap. He weighed the silver in his hand, his eyes lingering on it with a greedy sadness. "Hard times, Martha," he said, the statement not a kindness but a confirmation of her fall. She did not reply, simply took the coins he offered. The men who lingered on the store's porch would watch her come and go, their talk falling to a murmur. "Lives in that old silo," she heard one of them say, followed by a dry chuckle. "Got her mother out there, too." A shame. The pity was worse than the scorn. It was a dismissal, a judgment that she had failed not only herself but the frail woman in her care. She bought what she needed, her face a mask of calm indifference. She loaded her purchases onto a small handcart she had built and began the long walk back. She never hurried. She never looked back. Their words were just noise, like the wind. They could not see what she was building. They saw a rusted can on a patch of useless dirt. They could not feel the warmth rising from the earth, could not imagine the thick, secure walls she was plastering with her own 2 hands. Their vision was limited to what was, and hers was fixed on what could be. Their mockery was a fire that forged her resolve into something harder than steel. She did not need their approval. She needed the room to be finished before the first snow. One afternoon in late autumn, when the sky was the color of slate and the air held the first real bite of winter, a man on horseback appeared. He was not from the town. His clothes were sturdy but well-made, and he carried himself with an air of purpose. He rode a strong horse and had survey equipment strapped to his saddle. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, a geologist working for the territorial government. He was mapping water tables and mineral deposits. He had seen the smoke from her small cooking fire and had come to ask for water. Martha gave him some, watching him with a caution she reserved for all strangers. His eyes, however, were not on her, but on the silo. "Curious structure to be living in," he said, his tone neutral, observational. It's what we have, Martha replied. He walked over to it, his boots silent on the soft earth. He was not like the townsfolk, his gaze was analytical. He ran a hand over the metal, then peered inside the open doorway. He saw the small, clay-walled room she had built within the larger space. He did not laugh. He stepped inside, his curiosity piqued. Remarkable, he murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He knelt by the wall of her small room and placed a hand on it. He looked back at her, his eyes sharp with intelligence. It's warm, it was not a question. He pulled a thermometer from his satchel, then a compass, making notes in a small leather-bound book. He spent an hour taking readings, tapping on the concrete foundation, examining the soil. Finally, he stood up and faced her. He said, his voice holding a new respect. Do you know what you've done? This silo is situated over a low-grade geothermal fissure. The heat is negligible at the surface, but you've contained it. You've built a passive radiator. A heat sink. He spoke the words simply, as facts. For Martha, they were a revelation. He had given her the language for her intuition. He had taken her desperate, brute force creation and elevated it to science. He saw not a hovel, but a design. It was the first time anyone had looked at her work and seen not her poverty, but her ingenuity. He was the first person to understand. The validation was a quiet, profound relief, a warmth that spread through her chest, deeper and more potent than even the heat rising from the ground. Mr. Davies's report, filed with the territorial office, was a dry, technical document, but stories have a way of escaping such confines. Whispers of the hot silo began to circulate, altered by gossip and exaggeration. It was this story that brought Thomas to her door. He was a man who had known loss. A fever had taken his wife and son years ago, and since then he had wandered, putting his skill with tools and his knowledge of mechanics to use wherever he was needed. He arrived not on a fine horse, but on foot, leading a mule laden with tools. He had heard the tales in the next county and had come to see for himself. He was tall and lean, with hands that were never still and eyes that saw how things fit together. He did not ask for water or offer pity. He stood before the silo and looked, truly looked, for a long time. The surveyor said, "You captured the heat," he said, his voice a low baritone. "But you have a ventilation problem waiting to happen." Martha, who had been bracing for more curiosity or scorn, was taken aback by his directness. "My mother said it needed to breathe," she answered, pointing to the small opening she had left high in the wall. He nodded, a small, approving smile touching his lips. "Your mother is a wise woman." He stayed for 3 days. He did not try to take over her work. He watched, he listened, and he made suggestions. He showed her how to build a simple, clever flue system using flattened tin cans, one that would draw the stale air out while allowing fresh air to be warmed as it entered. He spoke of airflow and pressure, of how a structure, like a body, needed to inhale and exhale to remain healthy. His knowledge complemented hers perfectly. She knew the earth and the clay, he knew the air and the fire. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Their conversations were sparse, mostly about the work, but in the silences, something else was built. He saw the strength she did not voice, and she saw the gentleness he guarded behind his competence. When he helped her hang the thick, insulated door to the small room, their hands brushed. It was a simple touch, but it carried the weight of a promise. He never left. The winter came on schedule, with spitting snows and hard frosts that turned the landscape to iron. But then, in the heart of January, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and the wind fell utterly silent. The old-timers called it a weather breeder, a silence that gives birth to a storm. It was a blue norther, a wave of polar air that swept down from the frozen plains of Canada with a terrifying speed and a killing cold. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. The wind rose from a whisper to a scream, driving snow so thick it erased the world, burying fences and creek beds under a solid, white sea. Inside the town, a frantic battle began. Fires roared in hearths, consuming wood at an alarming rate, yet the cold seeped through the walls, through the very floors. In their small, insulated room within the silo, Martha, Agnes, and Thomas were safe. The geothermal heat, captured and held by the thick clay walls, kept the temperature in the tiny space at a steady, life-sustaining level. Outside, the wind shrieked like a predator, throwing itself against the metal shell of the silo, which groaned and shuddered in the onslaught. But inside their small haven, it was quiet. The air was warm and still. They could hear the storm, a distant, monstrous rage, but they could not feel it. Agnes slept peacefully in the small bed Martha had built for her. Martha and Thomas sat at a small table, the light of a single lantern casting their shadows on the curved wall. They did not need to speak. Everything was in the quiet sharing of the space, in the knowledge that what she had built, what they had perfected, was holding back the death that stalked the world outside. The crisis was not a moment of frantic action, but of profound, earned stillness. Every bucket of clay she had carried, every nail she had straightened, every joint Thomas had sealed, it had all led to this. To this small circle of warmth in the heart of a frozen world. It was enough. The blizzard raged for 4 days. On the 5th morning, the wind lessened, though the cold remained absolute. It was then that they saw the boy, a small, frost-rimed figure stumbling through the high drifts. It was Franklin's eldest son, sent as a last resort. Their farmhouse, built of thick timber but poorly sited and drafty, had become an icebox. Their firewood was nearly gone. Their livestock were freezing in the barn. The boy's face was pale with cold and fear. "Father sent me," he stammered, his words clouded with frozen breath. He said to ask if you had any room." Martha looked at the boy, and in his face, she did not see the avarice of the father, only the desperation of a child. She looked at Thomas, who simply nodded. There was no discussion, no hesitation. She led the boy back toward the main house, Thomas following with ropes and blankets. They found Franklin and his family huddled together, their faces gray with cold. Franklin could not meet her eyes. His pride had frozen and shattered, leaving only a raw, desperate need. Martha said nothing of the past. She simply said, "The children first." They brought them back to the silo, Franklin's wife weeping with a mixture of relief and shame. The small, warm room was only big enough for her own family, but the larger silo, though cold, was a shield from the wind. Thomas, with an engineer's ingenuity, rigged a series of pipes from flattened metal to divert a small channel of the rising warm air from under their floor into the main silo space. It wasn't much, but it raised the temperature from lethal to merely cold. Soon, others came. Mr. Gable, his face chapped and his arrogance stripped away, arrived with his wife. Then 2 other families from the edge of town. They filled the cold, cavernous space of the main silo, a small, shivering community of survivors, huddled in the shadow of the warm room they had once mocked. Martha shared her food, her water, her shelter. She did not offer sermons or demand apologies. Her triumph was not in their submission, but in her service. She had built a shelter to save her mother, and in doing so, she had saved them all. When the thaw finally came, it was slow and merciless, revealing the true cost of the storm. The town had been decimated. Lives had been lost. Herds had been wiped out. But the small community that had sheltered in the silo had survived. In the aftermath, the silo was no longer an object of pity or scorn. It became a landmark, a source of quiet wonder. People came to see it, to touch the warm walls of the inner room, to try and understand the simple miracle she had wrought. Franklin, humbled and broken, offered to give her the old farmhouse back. "It's yours, Martha," he said, his voice thick. "It was always yours," she refused. "My home is here," she told him, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a simple statement of fact. Her life was not in the house she had lost, but in the shelter she had built. She and Thomas married that spring, in a quiet ceremony held in the open space between the 2 silos. They never became wealthy. They never sought recognition. But they had something more valuable. They had a home that could not be shaken, a warmth that came from the earth itself. They expanded her design, not for profit, but for knowledge. Martha filled dozens of notebooks with meticulous observations, temperature readings, drawings of ventilation systems, notes on the best mixture of clay and straw. These books became her true legacy. Travelers and engineers came to study them, to learn from the silo widow, and the principles of her design began to appear in other homesteads across the territory, saving countless lives in the winters that followed. Years passed like the turning of the seasons. Martha grew old, her hands gnarled but still strong. She would sit on a bench outside the silo, watching her grandchildren play, their laughter echoing off the metal walls. The rust had deepened to a rich, dark orange, but the structure was sound. The door to the inner room was always left slightly ajar, a warm, gentle breath sighing out into the cool evening air. The temperature inside had not changed by a single degree since the day she first laid her hand on the earth. It was a constant, a quiet promise of warmth against the cold, a testament to a life built not on what was taken, but on what was made.